April 17, 1945. The war in Europe was bleeding out, but Germany's heart still refused to stop beating. The small town of Gardelegen, buried between forests and smoke, had fallen silent. American troops from the 102nd Infantry Division trudged through its ruins, rifles lowered, eyes scanning the wind-torn streets. The air was thick with the stench of burned oil and despair. Among the shattered barns and hollow-eyed civilians, they found something they hadn't expected: a group of German women. Their hands trembling, their faces as pale as snow. Wearing the remnants of military uniforms, the soldiers had seen death before. They had stepped over bodies in Normandy, watched villages crumble under artillery fire, and stared at the hollow faces of liberated prisoners. But this was different. These women were German auxiliary staff, clerks, nurses, and communications aides captured during the last push across the Elbe. They had been left behind, abandoned by their units, starving in barns without food or orders. The Americans stood still, their boots sinking into mud, realizing that their enemies weren't soldiers anymore. They were just human beings collapsing under hunger and shame for days. The women had hidden in the woods, drinking rainwater and eating grass and potato peels. When the Americans arrived, the women could barely raise their arms in surrender. One fell to her knees, whispering bit over and over. The war had stripped her of everything: her pride, her country, and her uniform. And as one young American sergeant knelt beside her, his rifle still slung across his shoulder, he muttered under his breath, "You're mine now." His voice wasn't filled with dominance or cruelty. It was a fragile statement, half protection, half disbelief. After months of fighting the enemy, he was now holding one of them, trembling and broken. The scene was surreal. A few yards away, tanks idled, their engines growling like restless beasts. Medics set up makeshift tents while officers tried to restore order among the chaos of surrendering prisoners. The women were herded gently into the camp perimeter. Some could barely walk. Others wept quietly, staring at the American flag fluttering over the command truck. They had been told the Americans were monsters, that capture meant humiliation, torture, or worse. But the soldiers brought them food: canned rations, chocolate bars, even cigarettes. A strange reversal unfolded before their eyes. The conquerors feeding the conquered. In one tent, Sergeant Robert Hale watched as a German nurse tried to eat a single slice of bread. Her hands shook so violently that the crumbs fell onto her lap. She had been part of a field hospital unit retreating from Magdeburg. When the convoy was ambushed, the men fled, leaving the women to fend for themselves. Hale, a farm boy from Kansas, had never seen such hunger. He gently placed a can of peaches before her. She looked up, her eyes glassy, her voice hoarse. "Warm," she whispered. "Because you're still alive," he answered. It was the only truth he could find in that broken landscape. Word spread through the American lines. More soldiers came to see the prisoners. Some stared in disbelief. These weren't the iron-willed women of Nazi propaganda, not the confident auxiliaries seen in newsreels smiling beside officers. They were gaunt and barefoot, their hair matted, their cheeks sunken. The reality of war had torn every illusion apart. Even the youngest among them, barely 20, carried the hollow look of someone who had seen too much. In the flickering lamplight of the camp, they looked more like ghosts than prisoners. Officers struggled to decide what to do. Protocol demanded that female POWs be treated separately and transported to rear camps for registration. But supplies were thin, and chaos ruled the front. The Americans had been advancing faster than their logistics could catch up. Every captured group became another burden to feed, guard, and move. Yet no one could bring themselves to abandon the women. They represented something unexpected in that final month of the war: the visible collapse of an empire built on delusion and denial. Night fell, and rain began to pour. The camp became a sea of mud and flickering lanterns. Somewhere in the darkness, a harmonica played. The soldiers huddled around fires, sharing rations and stories. Across from them, the German women sat wrapped in blankets, silent, watching their former enemies laugh softly under the rain. Some tried to speak in broken English, asking about home, about safety, and about when they would see their families again. No one had answers. Not even the officers knew how long any of this would last. The front lines were still shifting, and rumors whispered that Hitler was hiding somewhere in the south. In that uneasy peace, something human began to emerge. Acts of kindness replaced orders. A medic gave away his last chocolate bar. A corporal lent his jacket to a shivering girl who had once worked in a Luftwaffe telegraph office. For a fleeting moment, the war paused, not because of treaties or surrenders, but because exhaustion had finally stripped both sides of hatred. They were all just people caught inside history's storm. By dawn, the rain had stopped. The sky glowed a pale gray, and columns of smoke rose from the village chimneys. Hale stood near the perimeter fence, watching the German nurse asleep beside the fire. Her face, now peaceful, seemed almost innocent. He wondered what she had believed when the war began. If she had truly thought she was serving a cause greater than herself, or if she had simply followed orders like everyone else. Behind him, a fellow soldier muttered, "Feels strange, don't it? Feeding the people we've been fighting." Hale nodded. Maybe that's the only way it ends. Elsewhere in the camp, an officer drafted a report describing the condition of the prisoners: malnourished, dehydrated, psychologically broken. The report would be sent to headquarters, filed among countless others detailing the ruins of the Reich. But for those on the ground, paperwork meant little. The real war wasn't ending with a signature. It was ending in faces like these, starved, frightened, yet still alive. As the sun rose higher, a convoy of trucks rumbled toward the camp. Orders had arrived. The women were to be transferred to a temporary holding site near Braunschweig for processing. The soldiers prepared them for departure. Some helped them climb into the trucks. Others loaded blankets and medical supplies. One woman clutched Hale's sleeve before stepping aboard. "Will they treat us the same there?" she asked. He hesitated, then smiled faintly. "Better, I hope." The engines roared to life. The trucks rolled out slowly, leaving muddy tracks across the field. The soldiers watched in silence, their faces unreadable. Somewhere deep down, each of them felt a strange weight. Not victory, not pity, but the realization that even mercy had its price. In the distance, artillery rumbled once more, echoing like a reminder that the war was still not done. As Hale turned away from the disappearing convoy, he saw one last look, the German nurse gazing back through the canvas flap. Her eyes met his for a brief second, filled with something between gratitude and sorrow. Then she was gone, swallowed by the dust of the road. He stood there motionless, the sound of trucks fading into the wind. Around him, the camp seemed suddenly empty, as if the war had taken a final breath before its last exhale. But deep within the soldier's mind, one question lingered. What did victory really mean when even your enemy's hunger could break your heart? And as the thunder of distant guns rolled once again over the horizon, the answer began to take shape in silence. The convoy rattled through the broken German countryside, past gutted barns and burned-out armor. The road to Braunschweig cut across a land that no longer looked like Europe. It looked like the skeleton of civilization itself. As the trucks bounced over potholes, the captured German women clung to one another for balance. Their uniforms, once symbols of pride, were little more than rags now. Dust coated their faces, and their hollow eyes followed the endless line of American vehicles snaking toward the horizon. For the first time, the Reich's daughters were witnessing its ruin firsthand, mile after mile of it, when the convoy reached the holding area, a makeshift camp built beside a bombed railway yard. The U.S. engineers had already transformed the ruins into a machine of order. Barbed wire, floodlights, watchtowers, and rows of tents stretched across the fields. Everything moved with purpose: supply trucks unloading crates, field kitchens steaming with hot rations, medics checking the weak and the wounded. This was not chaos. It was the silent precision of an army that had perfected the logistics of victory. The German women, who had grown up believing the Allies were disorganized and crude, now saw the opposite. Every nail, every crate, every gallon of fuel had a destination and a schedule, and it all functioned without shouting or fear. That was the American advantage, not just weapons or manpower, but an invisible network of coordination. Every message, every command, and every meal traveled through radio signals, coded sheets, and motorized lines of supply. The women watched as U.S. soldiers operated their field radios, voices calm, their frequencies crisp and clear. To them, this was sorcery. During the Reich's collapse, their own communication lines had disintegrated, Cables cut, transmitters lost, batteries gone. But the Americans seemed to conjure connection out of thin air. Their voices leapt across miles of shattered land, linking headquarters, medical posts, and even supply trucks in motion. Inside one tent, Sergeant Hale listened as a radio operator adjusted the tuning dial, the device humming softly. The set weighs an SCR-300, a 35-pound field unit powered by vacuum tubes and carried like a backpack. It could transmit clear voice communication up to 10 miles. A miracle compared to the unreliable German POW sets that often failed in field conditions. Hale had used it in the Ardennes and in the Rhine crossings. It had saved his life more than once. The operator handed him the receiver, smiling. Division HQ just confirmed. They're sending more rations. 2 tons. Hale nodded. Good. They'll need it. On the other side of the tent, a German communications clerk sat listening, her face pale. She had once worked at a Luftwaffe relay post near Hanover. The sight of the American radio fascinated her. You carry that? She asked in broken English. In the field? Hale nodded again. Every squad has one. Her expression shifted, disbelief, then quiet awe. She thought of the last weeks of her service, when her own unit could barely send a single message. The Reich's front had died not just from hunger but from silence. Around the camp, more evidence of the American system unfolded. Trucks from the Quartermaster Corps rolled in with crates of K rations, 2,830 calories per box, containing biscuits, processed cheese, canned meat, coffee, sugar, and gum. Field cooks boiled water in 30-gallon vats, serving hot stew not just to the GIs but to the prisoners as well. Engineers from the 370th built latrines, water points, and makeshift infirmaries within hours. The women stared as order replaced ruin. They had spent years believing the propaganda that painted Allied soldiers as savages. But what they saw now was efficiency, discipline, and a strange kind of mercy. The nurse Hale had helped, her name was Liesel Brandt, was assigned to assist the medics. Her hands were still trembling from weakness, but she could bandage wounds and distribute medicine. She watched the Americans work with quiet fascination. They shared their supplies freely, even letting her handle precious items like sulfa powder and morphine syringes. Liesel had heard rumors in the Reich that the Americans used barbaric field methods. But now, seeing their portable surgical kits, she realized how advanced they truly were. Each soldier carried a first aid packet sealed against moisture, and each medic was trained to perform triage with mechanical precision. When Hale showed her the contents of a field medical chest, sterilizers, plasma bottles, surgical clamps, her eyes widened. You have all this here? She whispered. In the field? He smiled faintly. We bring the hospital with us. That phrase stayed with her. The Americans didn't wait for safety to heal their wounded. They built healing into the very act of war. It was a concept she had never imagined. Meanwhile, the camp's command tent buzzed with coordination. American officers used portable typewriters, field telephones, and cipher sheets to relay daily reports to Corps headquarters. Everything was recorded, every movement traced. The Germans watching from behind the wire could barely comprehend it. Their own army had crumbled into disconnected fragments. No fuel, no orders, no hope. But here, in the hands of their captors, the machinery of war still ran like clockwork. It was a revelation, one that cut deeper than any defeat that Liesel's health began to return. She spent her days assisting in the infirmary, treating both German and American patients. The boundaries between sides blurred. A young corporal with a shrapnel wound joked that she had steadier hands than some doctors. Another soldier gave her a tin of cocoa powder, telling her it would help her regain strength. Slowly, she began to speak more, her English improving with every exchange. Hale found himself listening more than talking. She told him how her brother had died in Stalingrad and how she had joined the auxiliaries out of duty, not conviction. The war, she said, had stolen everything. Their future, their truth, their sense of being right. For Hale, her words echoed the exhaustion of every campaign. He had seen the faces of the enemy up close before, but never like this, stripped of arrogance, reduced to fragility. And yet, behind that fragility, there was resilience. He noticed how she still straightened her uniform and still tried to maintain dignity. She was not begging for pity. She was fighting for the last piece of herself that the war had not destroyed. Days passed. and the camp grew quieter. Rumors spread that the Allies had surrounded Berlin. The end was near, but no one celebrated. For the Americans, it meant more prisoners, more mouths to-feed, and more reminders of a war that refused to die. Hale watched convoys come and go, carrying POWs westward. Liesel stood beside him one evening as the sun dipped below the ruined rail yard. "It's strange," she said softly. "We are prisoners, but it feels like freedom." He looked at her, unsure how to answer. Perhaps she was right. Perhaps freedom was not about nations or flags, but the moment one stopped being afraid. That night, an officer approached Hale. "Orders came down," he said. "The female POWs are to be relocated to a civilian camp near Kassel. We'll escort them at dawn." Hale nodded, but a heaviness settled in his chest. He found Liesel by the fire later, wrapping bandages for the morning's transport. When he told her, she said nothing. Only after a long silence did she whisper, "Will I see you again?" He hesitated, then said the only thing that felt true. "I don't know, but you'll live. That's what matters." The next morning, the trucks lined up once more. The engines coughed to life, and the prisoners climbed aboard. As Liesel stepped onto the tailgate, she turned back one last time. Hale raised his hand in farewell. She mirrored the gesture, not as a prisoner, but as a survivor. The convoy rolled out into the mist, and the sound of its engines faded into the distance. But deep inside Hale's memory, her words lingered. "It feels like freedom." He didn't yet know how prophetic that would be. How, within weeks, the full horror of Germany's collapse would emerge, and with it, the unbearable truth of what freedom truly cost. The last weeks of April 1945 passed like a fever dream. Germany was collapsing from within, its cities in ashes, its people wandering through the wreckage like shadows searching for a vanished world. The American convoys kept moving east, carrying prisoners, supplies, and the weight of victory that no one could yet celebrate. For the soldiers of the 102nd Division, the end came not with a roar, but with a kind of stunned silence. They had fought for nearly a year, crossed rivers and minefields, and watched comrades fall. Yet when the guns finally quieted, they found themselves surrounded not by cheering crowds, but by the broken faces of those they had defeated. Liesel Brandt and the other captured auxiliaries arrived at the Kassel camp 2 days before Hitler's death. It was larger, better organized, and run by military police under strict supervision. They were fed, clothed, and given medical checks. But the real change was psychological. The women, who had once worn the eagle and swastika with pride, now moved through the camp as if learning to walk again. They had been part of the machinery of the Reich, yet now they stood outside it, seeing it for what it truly was, a machine that had devoured its own children. American officers began recording testimonies. Intelligence units sought information about communications networks, Luftwaffe logistics, and code procedures. Liesel was among those questioned. Her answers were factual, measured, and tinged with exhaustion. When they asked why she had joined, she said simply, "Because I thought it was right." The officer didn't respond. He just wrote it down, another line in the endless ledger of a war built on belief. But as she left the tent, she saw Hale again, now attached to a logistics detail delivering medical supplies. For a moment, the war fell away. Their eyes met across the compound, two people on opposite sides of history, bound by a shared fatigue that words could never describe. The American occupation strategy unfolded with the same precision that had driven their armies. Engineers rebuilt bridges, quartermasters fed civilians, and field hospitals treated the sick regardless of nationality. The same organizational power that had conquered the Reich was now being used to heal it. Trucks rolled through ruins carrying not shells, but bread. Radio networks, once used to coordinate attacks, now transmitted humanitarian orders. It was a quiet transformation, one that stunned those who had expected revenge. Among the prisoners, a strange mix of emotions spread. Gratitude mingled with guilt. They were alive because of the people they had been taught to hate. Some couldn't bear it. Others clung to it as a fragile kind of redemption. Liesel, now working as a nurse under American supervision, saw it every day. Former clerks, typists, and drivers breaking down in tears as they realized that survival demanded acceptance. The Reich had promised them glory. The Americans offered them discipline and mercy instead. Hale, meanwhile, found himself reassigned to a liaison post near Gardelegen. His job was to coordinate the transfer of POWs to civilian authorities and monitor the rebuilding of local hospitals. Every morning, he received lists, names, numbers, movements. But at night, when the paperwork was done, he often thought of the people behind those lists. He remembered the look in Liesel's eyes, the tremor in her hands, the whisper of "it feels like freedom." Those memories didn't fade. They followed him like echoes of a war that refused to end inside him. The psychological impact on both sides ran deeper than official reports could measure. For the Americans, confronting the humanity of their former enemies created a quiet moral reckoning. They had been trained to fight evil, yet now they were feeding it, healing it, and even befriending fragments of it. Letters home began to change in tone. Soldiers who had once written about victory now spoke of hunger, children, and the strange dignity of those they had captured. One corporal described seeing German civilians line up for rations. They looked like ghosts waiting to be forgiven. There was no triumph in his words, only weariness. For the German women, captivity became a slow education. They learned English phrases, followed American camp rules, and adapted to routines that valued fairness over fear. Some began to smile again. Others remained silent, unable to reconcile kindness from those they had been told were barbarians. But the greatest transformation came from understanding the scale of what their nation had done. News filtered through the camps, the mass graves, the photographs. Liesel saw them one afternoon when an American officer pinned clippings to a notice board. Her knees gave out beneath her. The world she had believed in was gone. The guilt was unbearable, but in that collapse lay the beginning of truth. Months passed. Summer turned to autumn, and the occupation solidified. POW camps became repatriation centers, then labor detachments. Many of the women were sent to assist in hospitals or rebuilding efforts. Liesel requested to stay in the medical corps. Her experience made her valuable, and the Americans agreed. She worked alongside Allied medics treating wounded civilians from all sides. Hale saw her once more in late September during a supply run to Kassel. She was thinner, quieter, but alive. They spoke briefly about food, about peace, about what came next. When he left, she gave him a small locket she had kept hidden since the war began. Inside was a faded picture of her brother in uniform. "He believed in something that never existed," she said softly. "I hope you find something that does." Hale carried that locket for the rest of his life. The war's legacy didn't end with the ceasefire. It reshaped the meaning of victory itself. The U.S. Army's treatment of prisoners, even enemy women who had served a collapsing regime, became a cornerstone of post-war reconstruction. Psychologists studying the POW camps noted that humane treatment accelerated denazification far more effectively than punishment. Feeding the defeated had become a weapon of peace. Mercy had achieved what bombs could not. For men like Hale, that realization changed everything they thought they knew about strength. In time, both of them would vanish into history's quiet corners. One soldier among millions, one nurse among thousands. But their encounter at the edge of a dying empire carried a lesson that outlived them. Wars are fought with steel and fire, but they are ended by compassion. The moment a man looks into the eyes of his enemy and sees hunger instead of hatred, the war within him begins to die. That was what Hale understood as he walked away from Kassel for the last time. The locket warm in his hand, the memory of her voice still clear. Years later, long after Europe had been rebuilt, veterans spoke of how strange the end had felt, not triumphant, but human. They remembered not just the victories, but the faces of those they fed, the hands they steadied, and the quiet exchange of bread for trust. And though history would file it all under numbers and reports, the truth of it lingered in every soldier who had once looked across a barbed wire fence and realized that mercy could be stronger than vengeance, somewhere in an attic in Kansas. Decades later, that locket would be found, tarnished. The photograph nearly faded away. Beneath it lay a folded paper, yellowed with age. A single line was written across it in a careful hand. "You're mine now, not as an enemy, but as a memory that proved we were still human." In the end, that was the real victory. Not conquest, not surrender, but the quiet rediscovery of humanity in the ashes of war.